The younger children, who had behaved immaculately throughout the service, began to laugh. Ruth hesitated just inside the church gate and watched the scene from a distance, still intrigued by the idea that they were all strangers. She was 18, naive, and the obvious psychological insight seemed now the most important thing to have come from James's death. She looked around her for examples and saw Cathy Cairns. She had always thought Mrs. Cairns a well-groomed and sophisticated woman, but saw now that she had something of the air of a water-rat, with big front teeth, a faint moustache, and fair tufts of hair escaping from her hat. No wonder James ditched her, Ruth thought, though she had always liked Cathy before, felt very close to her, and turned back to the church to wait for her mother, who was, even now after 4 children, still beautiful. Meg, her mother, was the last person out of the church. She stood for a moment to compose herself, and then took charge, shepherding the guests to their cars, flattering the vicar with her thanks. Meg was magnificent, Ruth thought, but then she had known that all along. Meg was always magnificent. As she walked towards the car, Ruth allowed herself to look at Aidan more. She watched with disappointment as he climbed into the Cairns Land Rover without seeming to see her. She had planned to invite him to accompany her in Meg's car, imagined them squeezed together in the back along with the children. It occurred to her that she might be in love with him, and that was a revelation too. They drove the 3 miles to Markham Mill in a convoy, which caused quite a stir in the hamlet of Markham Law. So many smart cars, all in a row, so many women in hats. The residents had heard about the memorial service from Florrie Duffy, who cleaned at the mill when her health allowed, and they were looking out. "More like a wedding," one said, "than a funeral. What a shame they'd had such a cold and rainy day." When they arrived at the mill, the drive was already full, and they had to park in the lane outside. This minor disruption to usual practice seemed to upset Meg, and Ruth saw that her mother's composure was precarious, and she was more distressed than she was letting on. "It's too bad," she said, "too inconsiderate." And there were tears of frustration in her eyes. She slammed the car doors loudly, hardly giving the children time to scramble out. Ruth found the show of ill-temper disturbing. It was unlike her mother to lose control in such an obvious way. In the late afternoon gloom, the mill still looked half derelict, a rickety wooden structure far too big for its position here at the mouth of the bay. Ruth had always thought that the mill was too romantic a name for it. The mill conjured up wind sails, water wheels. This building had been put up in the 30s for the preparation of animal feeds, and the family business had struggled on until 1960, when it finally went bankrupt. Then it had stood empty for more than 30 years. There had been many schemes for its restoration. It had such potential for development, right on the shore, surrounded by unspoiled countryside. There were plans for a holiday complex, a hotel, but these involved the demolition of the mill or a dramatic change to its structure, and for some reason it had become a listed building. And Markham Bay was a wildlife sanctuary, internationally recognized. Prospective developers were put off by the possibility of objections by conservation groups. So the mill had remained empty until Ruth's mother, Meg Morrissey, had arrived to take it on, with her grand vision of a different sort of field centre, a college of the countryside. She had seemed to sweep them all along, even James, with her enthusiasm. They had uprooted from London, left friends behind, to make the project a reality. Now it was the family's home and workplace, and to Ruth it was unthinkable that they would live anywhere else. Meg stood at the wide door to the big room, part lecture theatre, part common room, where all the indoor teaching took place. She seemed to have calmed her crossness at the lack of parking space, and was greeting her guests affectionately by name, as if their presence gave her enormous pleasure and consolation. Although many of the mourners must have been only distant acquaintances, there was a lot of hugging and kissing. Ruth found such physical contact disconcerting, and slipped past her mother while she was engaged in a particularly extravagant embrace. Then she stood in a corner and watched what was going on.